Well, hey, happy Super Tuesday, everybody, and welcome to yet another fall publishing webinar. I'm Chris Beatties, editor of Growertalks and Green Profit Magazine and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we tackle today's really interesting topic, Mangave Madness, the story behind this fast-growing succulent hybrid and its potential benefits to the world of horticulture. That may be I think that's the longest title of any webinar in the 10 years I've been hosting these things, but it's also the first time I've talked about a brand new crop introduction and with a key breeder of that crop, no less. So I'm just as excited as you are to learn more about Mangave. I've learned two things so far, how to pronounce it. It's not Mangave, unless you're in Europe, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And it is not a cross between mangrove and agave, as I believe somebody may have reported on the internet somewhere. Well, for this topic, we've got to have an expert, as always, and we do have one. He is Hans Hansen, Director of New Plant Development for Walter's Gardens in Zeeland, Michigan. Welcome, Hans.
Thank you.
Hans, now where are you broadcasting from today? I assume, are you in Zeeland, Michigan?
I am in Zeeland, Michigan. 37 degrees, cloudy.
Are you out amongst the mangaves, as that illustration shows, or are they covered under a bit of snow or anything right now?
The bed is under just a dusting of snow. We were 50 the last 3 days, so most of our snow is melted. In fact, some of our staff is out doing a little bit of spring cleanup today.
The weather is conducive to that. I believe spring is on the way. Don't let me jinx it in any way. It's going in, goes in like a lion, out like a lamb, March, something along those lines. But anyway, I'm not going to take up any more time bantering. You know me, Chris Beatties, from the high atop the Ball Publishing broadcast studios, where I'll be pushing the buttons. Those of you who've attended these webinars, you know that you can ask questions. Please do so. There's a question bar somewhere, probably on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm not 100% certain, but you can find it. Ask the question, type it in. If it's pertinent to the topic at hand, we'll get to it right then. Otherwise, we'll save it for the Q&A period. And if it's just a little too complicated or convoluted to handle on air, I'm going to give you an email address at the end where you can send your question. And as always, this webinar will be archived as soon as possible after it's over, just in case you either need to leave early because a customer came in, or you want to relive it or share it with your boss, colleagues or employees or friends or what have you. So same place you signed up for it, growertalks.com/webinars. Very convenient. So that said, Hans, that's all the housekeeping I've got. So I'm going to click over to your first slide and let you take it away with Mangave Madness.
Thanks, Chris. Like you mentioned, I work at Walter's Gardens. I have been here nearly 11 years as Director of New Plant Development. Prior to working at Walter's Gardens in Michigan, I was Director of Research and Development at Shady Oaks Nursery in Waseca, Minnesota. And that was a wholesale nursery. We had a tissue culture lab that primarily did hostas. Walter's Gardens is located in Zeeland, Michigan, about 2.5 hours west of Detroit, between Grand Rapids and Holland. We are a USDA Zone 6, so we are basically the banana belt of Michigan, and we have lake effect snow. Prior to moving to Michigan, my idea of lake effect was a lot of snow. And although we do get 75 inches of snow annually, it's more the moderation that Lake Michigan provides, keeping the highs and the lows fairly even. That is the real take-home message for me, and the lack of sunlight. So we have a lot of cloud cover during the wintertime, and the joke is take a good long look at the sun in November, because you might not see that until March again. A lot of people are on vitamin D for that reason. But because of that environment, our sandy soils next to the lake, the a moderate temperature, the snow cover, we can grow a lot of plants that you wouldn't think of growing in Michigan. We can grow agapanthus, Nephofia, eucomis, all those crops from South Africa that you wouldn't normally think of being hardy in Michigan. Right next to Zeeland is Holland, Michigan, and the population there goes back to its Dutch roots. Each year they celebrate tulip time. There's about 4.5 million tulip bulbs planted around the town. And in the first 2 weekends in May, it's a great destination to enjoy that environment. A little bit about history of Walter's Gardens. It was founded in 1946 by Dennis and Harriet Walters. It began as a company of about 20 employees, mainly with field production. So initially specialized in just a few genera of perennials, mostly tall garden phlox, creeping phlox, delphiniums, Shasta daisies, and gaillardia, and this supplied the local market, West Michigan. Over the course of the next 74 years, Walter's Gardens has developed into the nation's leader in bare root perennials. Currently, we offer over 1,000 varieties of perennials, and we grow on 1,500 acres of field production. During any one season, about 500 of those acres would be in actual perennial crops. The rest would be in crop rotation, green manure, building up the soil structure. Currently, we have about 300 employees, and we ship throughout North America, United States, Canada. Our genetics are licensed in Europe, Asia, and Australia, so plants that have been bred from our breeding program are available in other countries through our licensees. And we are still a family-owned company. We are now on generation 3, so we're very proud of that. I work in new plant development. The hybridizing team is comprised of 4 full-time staff. And in the summertime, we have up to 6 summer interns. Generally, they're college students that work for us during the summer months, helping with the research, the pollinating, the planting of the seedlings, and taking care of the maintenance of the plants. We have about 80 different genera we work on. Some have very specific breeding goals, and some are really long-term crops that we work on year after year. Things like hibiscus, hemerocalis, good presence in the industry, and it's an ongoing breeding program for those. Personally, I've had a lifelong interest in plants. My memory does not go back before the time I wasn't interested in plants. My family has pictures of me when I was 3 years old, planting onions in the garden. When I was a teenager, my nickname in school was Plantson, and I just love being outside, botanizing, working with nature. That's really just what makes me happy. Going to Mangave, the first situation where Mangave was identified was at Hempstead, Texas, at Yucca-Do Nursery. Carl Schoenfeld had been going on botanizing trips to Mexico in the late 1990s, and on one of those trips, he collected seed of Manfreda variegata. He got the seed back into the nursery, planted them, and after they germinated, there were 2 seedlings in the flat that did not look like any of the other seedlings. He compared it to the cowbird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest after they hatch. They outgrow all the rest of those. So he had set those 2 plants aside, was looking at them, and during one of the visits from Plant Delights, Tony Avent was there looking at those 2 plants, and they put their heads together, and Tony asked what other plant could possibly have been growing in the same area as that Manfreda. And Carl looked through his notes, and they found out that Agave Celcii was actually growing in the same location, and that was the first known cross between an agave and a Manfreda, and Tony coined the name Mangave. I was at Shady Oaks Nursery at that time, and they shared a plant with me to put into tissue culture production, and that is kind of when the world of hostas collided with the world of agaves, and we were able to put it in micropropagation, tissue culture that, and it was introduced to the trade through both Plant Delights Nursery and Yucca-Do Nursery. The variety that was commercialized was called Macho Mocha, named by Carl Schoenfeld. And if you look at the picture, the one that he's standing next to in the blue shirt was actually the sister seedling that wasn't commercialized to the degree that Macho Mocha was. So Macho Mocha is basically the type specimen, the first of the named Mangaves. There was also one that came out of Japan a few years later, and that was called Bloodspot. And that is a hybrid between a Manfreda and Agave macroacantha. And you can see it's pretty much a perfect intermediate. Both of the two early Mangaves had a lot of the red coloration on the foliage, which really made them attractive and stand out as being unique and novel plants in the succulent world. Of course, agaves, which are generally used as the pollen source for the cross, have incredible diversity. If you can look through the picture, there's different leaf shapes, different leaf habits. They're just very architectural. They create a lot of drama in the garden. And most of them have terminal and marginal spines, which command a lot of respect. In the nursery, agaves are very slow growing. They have a long life expectancy. Most varieties take between 7 to 25 years to flower. So they are a long-term crop. They last a long time in a collection or where they're hardy in the garden. Manfreda, on the other hand, have a fairly rapid growth rate. And there are many species of Manfreda that are deciduous. So like a hosta, they will go dormant in the fall, reemerge, come back in the spring. They also have more succulent foliage. They lack the terminal and marginal spines. And most of them will have these really nice purple pigments in the foliage, some more so than others. But that's a really nice trait that can be passed on to the progeny in the Mangave crosses. Our early work with the Mangaves, breeding them at Walter's Gardens, created pretty nice intermediates between the two. So they captured the nice red pigment from the Manfreda, the fast growth rate from the Manfreda, some of the architecture from the Agave, and of course the absence of terminal and marginal spines, which made them a lot more user-friendly in containers and in the landscape. As the years went by, we were able to make more and more crosses through the generations. When we would back cross the Mangaves to the Manfredas, we were able to pick up more of the Manfreda influence. So two examples would be the dreadlocks, which is probably the largest of that type, nearly 3 feet across, the other being Desert Dragon. And here you have more succulent foliage, incredibly rippled, undulated leaf margins, no spines or thorns at all, and then the really nice dark pigment from the Manfreda. If you were to use the agave as the parent to back cross in the other direction, having 2/3 agave, 1/3 Manfreda, you can change the plant habit and morphology to have plants that resemble agaves. And you can see some of the examples, Tooth Fairy being one of the more interesting. It's a more compact, modest-sized plant with really attractive cinnamon-colored marginal spines, the really nice exaggerated terminal spine. And then if you look closely on the foliage, you've got these leaf imprints, which are the pattern of the previous leaf, and you see that as they unfurl. Blue Dart is another example. This looks quite a bit like in agave. It's got a really nice symmetrical form, thicker leaves, and lacks the red pigment that we usually select for in most of the Mangave hybrids. And last but not least, probably our largest introduction to date would be Iron Man. That was a cross from 2012, and that flowered for the first time this fall. So you can see just the dramatic large plant that it forms in the landscape. Unfortunately, it was not able to complete the flowering cycle before we had a really hard frost, but it got about 8 feet tall. We estimated it probably would have reached out at 13 feet if we had a milder winter. In order to make the cross, you would need agave pollen, and during the 11 years at Walter's Gardens, we have flowered quite a few agaves, but most of our pollen does come from friends in the industry through botanical gardens, private collections. And here is a picture of Agave americana, subspecies Proto-Americana, at Plant Delight's Nursery, and their horticulturalist, Jeremy, is collecting pollen. And that plant is probably about 20 feet tall. So there he is, standing on a ladder, collecting pollen for us. And if you think about it, there's other insects that are also there collecting pollen. So he had to fight the wasps and the bees off to get the pollen for us. There's two ways pollen can be transferred. Probably the easiest would be to cut these inflorescence off with all the flower buds ready to open, overnight it. We can recut the stem, flower them, and use fresh pollen. The other way would be to dry the pollen, make sure it's completely dry, and then it stores quite well. And we have a pollen bank where we have dried pollen and store it to use over the years. And that's quite effective. One of the easiest ways to kill pollen is through moisture, so it's very important to keep it dry. An example of some of the centrifuge vials and processing the pollen. The pollen keeps its viability for quite a long time. We are still using some of the pollen from our earlier work, which goes back to 2009. And if you can imagine some of these agaves taking 7 to 25 years to flower, it's important to save the pollen because the chances of having that fresh pollen yearly is quite low. In order to make the cross, we would take a centrifuge vial with the pollen into the greenhouse where the Mangaves or Manfredas are flowering. Take a paintbrush to apply the pollen. If you look closely, a lot of those paintbrushes have had the number of bristles reduced, so we use less pollen and don't waste it. We do sanitize the paintbrushes between crosses to eliminate cross-contamination. You don't want to apply pollen from one vial and then switch vials, which would be a different agave species, and use the same paintbrush because you would have contamination. Two ways to make the cross, the hard way or the smart way. Because these are containerized, you can manipulate the plant on its side to make the crosses instead of climbing up onto a ladder. Some of these reach 8, 9, 10 feet tall. So you would need a step ladder to make the crosses. You can have a teammate help you out, hold the plant, so it's easier to make the cross. Mangave flowers last about 2 to 3 days. If you look closely to the right of the screen, the flower at the top has just opened up. The flower color is the lightest. As the flower ages, the pollen becomes dehisced from the stamen. The stigma becomes receptive. That's on day 2. And by day 3, the flower starts senescing. It's probably not receptive at that point. So you basically have 1 day where that flower is receptive, not unlike a hosta or daylily, which they are related to. If your hybrid cross is successful, you will get a seed pod. The seed pods range in size from about the size of a marble to about 2 inches based on the genetics of the cross. An individual pod can hold up to 25 to 30 seeds. And if you look at the picture with Maria. She is cleaning and accessioning the seeds, putting them into an Excel spreadsheet. The seeds that are black in color are viable. The light tan colored ones would not be. So you can see across the board, some of the crosses yielded very successful fertile seeds, and the amount of fertile seeds in the cross is actually the minority. We sow the seeds as freshly as possible. We found that when you plant them fresh, you have fairly good germination. We plant these in a 68-degree greenhouse with supplemental lighting. We do a lot of this work in the winter, and in about 2 weeks, you can see the first cotyledon emerge from the soil. Many times that empty seed will be on the tip of the cotyledon, and from then on, the foliage starts to come away from the crown. You can see when the plants are cellulated, we usually have about 2 sets of true leaves, and we go from open trays to 72 count trays. And then each time the plant is planted into a larger container, we cull. So we only keep the most unique, the most distinct, and the fastest, most vigorous plants from the cross. So this is what a typical crop would look like at the end of the first year. And you can see that a lot of the plants are starting to diversify. Some have a much faster growth rate than others, just depending on the parents. Nearing the end of year 2, you can see just how fast they have grown. The siblings in the cross are arranged in rows, so the sister seedlings would be top to bottom on the picture on the left, and you can see the family resemblance within the seedlings in the cross. And as the plants mature, just how distinct each individual one is, and you can see the degree of pigment in the foliage. A lot of times the actual form is quite similar within the cross, but the pigment in the foliage differs between each seedling. And usually at this stage, year 3, sometimes year 4 is where we make selections. Of course, like I mentioned, every time we pot the crop into a larger size container, it goes through a pretty substantial culling process. So we could start with 50 to 100 seedlings per cross. In the pot, by the time you get to year 3, you might only have 9 left out of that cross, if it's a good cross and the plants are distinct and worth keeping. We will flower some on from each cross to use it in further breeding if it has good traits that we want to continue working with, or a handful from each year would actually be slated for production. The way we propagate our Mangave for commercial production is through tissue culture. Many of these produce pups off the side of the plant, which a homeowner can separate and produce new plants from. They're asexual. They'll be carbon copies of what the original plant was. But for a commercial nursery, for uniformity, we do use tissue culture, and that is basically propagating the plant in sterile conditions. We use laminar flow hoods with positive air pressure. The plants would be in a sterile media that would have sugar, which is a carbon source that is the end product of photosynthesis. The plants would have all the vitamins, hormones, or nutrients that they would need. And based on the part of the tissue culture process, initially we would use cytokinins, which encourage cell division to build up the stock. Once we reach a critical mass and we're able to start rooting plants out, the media would be switched to a hormone that has auxins, which cause root formation. The process between making a selection, putting it in the tissue culture lab, and getting plants back out into the greenhouse takes close to 2 years. And during that time, we do some sample runs, make sure that they're true to type. There hasn't been any surprises along the way. And when we're comfortable, they go into the catalog. We sell them 2 different sizes. We sell a full tray of 72, which would be 72 of one variety. And you can see the picture on the left, we have Lavender Lady in the middle of the screen, and the picture on the right, you would have Bad Hair Day. If you look at those white sachets in the picture, those are biological insects that we use in the greenhouse. In this particular greenhouse range, we use Cucumaris, which is a beneficial mite, predator mite that would eat other insects, and that's because we try to be as organic and pesticide-free as possible, so we really do like using bio-insects to really help keep the population down. We have two different options for sorted trays. We realize not all of our customers can use 72 of one single variety. So there are two mixes folks can use. The first is a Mad About You mix. The other is a Mad in Love mix. And these would be 6 varieties in a tray, 12 plants of each of the variety. Each variety is individually labeled and does come with picture tags as well. If a customer receives our product in April and grows them throughout the summer, this is what one can expect. Throughout the year, we grow them in high light. Direct sun usually gives the best coloration. They take quite a bit of moisture. We like to grow them with about the same regime that we grow hostas, so it's moist, well-drained soil. Of course, they will take much less moisture, but that does cut into their finish rate. So it may be counterintuitive since they have an agave in the background, but in nursery production, they really do have the fastest growth rate with more water than a cactus or an agave. Three-year-old plants at this stage, you can just see how much diversity and how distinct each individual cultivar are, and just how collectible and unique they are. So you've got everything from the red tones, the blues, some variegation, lighter midribs. It really is a fun and exciting product to work with.
Hans, before we move away from production, let me ask a quick question from Carl, who wants to know about fertilizer for production.
In our fertilizer program, we fertilize about the same rate that we do on most of our other nursery products. So it's a good rate, I think up to 200 parts per million, constant liquid feed.
All right. Do you know the NPK ratio of the feed you happen to be using?
I don't. I can have a grower get back to you on that.
All right. Well, Carl, we can we'll give him the email at the end, and you can type that in if you want more specifics on the nutrition program for Mangave.
Yep. In container production, we use Osmocote as a slow release fertilizer.
There you go. All right. Thanks very much.
A couple collages of the samples in the Mad About Mangave assortment. You've got the Pineapple Express, Lavender Lady, Ink Blot, which were some of the earlier releases. You can see the really nice symmetry most of these have. It's hard to see in the picture, but they do have a lot of differences in leaf size, leaf shape, plant maturity. Mission to Mars is one of our largest. It matures about 3 feet across when it's mature. In this portfolio, Sponge Paint probably has the most compact growth rate, about 12 inches across. Catch a Wave with the really undulated extreme leaf margins. Some of these are so extreme they almost touch at the top of the plant. And polar opposite would be Bad Hair Day, very flexible, fibrous plant habit. This was a hybrid of Geminiflora, the twin flower agave, and this is one of the favorite ones to use in containers. But you can see there's just so much diversity in leaf color, form, size, just very collectible plants. Back to Lavender Lady. Of course, the pollen source was Agave attenuata, which is a large agave used along the coast in California. And you can see, the magnificent size it reaches when it's mature, the really dramatic inflorescence. and the leaf size. Lavender Lady has really toned that size down. You still have the really nice symmetry, the moderate growth rate, but a beautiful lavender wash to the foliage. Couple examples of the intensity of the spots. By crossing and selfing, we've been able to really intensify the amount of spots in the leaves so that the plant almost appears completely red. Mission to Mars with that really nice dark red coloration on a large plant. And then Redwing, which is a more compact plant, a lot more leaves in the rosette, also with a really nice, beautiful red coloration. And then some of the newer hybrids, pushing that reddish coloration to almost that purple tone, which is Blazing Saddles in this instance. A little bit about the red pigment, not all that different from myself, Scandinavian background, fair complexion with freckles. I always have freckles, but you really don't notice them until I go outside in the summertime. The Mangaves that have the spots are always there. You probably won't see them in the tissue culture process or in the greenhouse. It's not until they get exposed to direct UV light outside that pigment really becomes intensified. And the best example is the visual example on the right side of the screen. You can see two plants from the same crop. The one on the left spent its entire summer outside with direct UV light. The other one with the green leaves stayed inside over the greenhouse, had winter white poly, blocking out the UV rays, and so it did not pick up that really dark red pigment in its foliage. And then, as happens so many times in the tissue culture process, once in a while you will find a sport. One of the first variegated sports we released and became part of the Mad About Mangave program was Kaleidoscope. And I think this name fits the plant so perfectly because in the low light conditions, the foliage will have a yellow margin. In full direct sunlight, it will turn more of an orange color, and it graduates between orange, kind of a reddish color, and then that cherry color. And you can see the spots really become dramatic when exposed to the UV rays. They're so fun to use in combinations with other plants. You can do the color echoes with an example of the coleus, with the burgundy foliage of the coleus complementing the Mangave. And then, of course, in the fall, you can put on a nice burgundy sweater and complement that setting as well. The other sport from Jaguar that we selected was snow leopard. Like Kaleidoscope, under low light, the margin will be white. When exposed to high UV rays, that white will turn a beautiful cherry color. So you've got this really nice pink margin with that darker center, and then the spots, of course, really pop and complete the picture. One nice thing about snow leopard and Kaleidoscope, they offset freely, so you always have a lot of pups coming along the base of the plant. Our first variegated seedling from an intentional cross is Navajo Princess. This was not a sport. This was from an intentional cross for variegation. This is a medium-sized Mangave. The leaves are cup shape, and then they arch at the tips. It's more fibrous than the succulent leaves of the Kaleidoscope and snow leopard, and this is a solitary plant. It just forms a nice rosette. It does not offset at the base. A few more examples of the genetics of the Mangaves. One of my favorites, of course, is Agave Lophantha because of the beautiful central midrib with that nice yellow coloration. Of course, Lophantha commands a lot of respect because it does have a terminal spine at the tip of the leaf and these really intense spines along the side margins of the foliage. When you use Lophantha as a pollen source, that midrib is passed on to the progeny. One of the selections that we did name from that cross is Racing Stripes. Once again, you can see that really nice central band. The foliage is less lethal. It's the spines are not nearly as sharp as they are with Lopantha. And because of the Manfreda influence, you have a lot longer, more dramatic foliage. The other agave we use for the banding in the progeny is Agave nisidensis. And this has quite a fast growth rate, and you can see some of the examples of plants over the generations that we've developed using the Agave nisidensis. So shadow waltz would be one of the earlier ones. You've got a nice dark emerald green leaf with that yellow band on the center. Frosted elegance, which is more of a powdery blue color with a lighter midrib, and then combining that purple pigment of the mangaves with the yellow band. And you can see probably the best example with center of attention, where that yellow band is now pink when you've got the red superimposed on top of that yellow band.
Hans, while we're looking at varieties, is there an easy or a foolproof way to tell if we're looking at a Mangave versus a Manfreda or an Agave?
So in our collection, we have two Manfredas. We have mint chocolate chip and we have cherry chocolate chip. They have no spines. The leaves are fairly succulent. As the genetics become more and more complex, it gets more difficult to distinguish between an agave and a mangave when you go into generation, probably 3 or 4, if you've back crossed them to an agave, each generation.
So if you see it in a botanical garden and it doesn't happen to be labeled or something, are there any kind of tips or tricks to tell the difference between the 3 different crops?
So most of the mangaves we've selected will have that purple pigment or spots on the foliage, and that comes from a Manfreda. Many of the Manfredas are deciduous, so especially the ones native to the States tend to go dormant in the fall and then reemerge in the spring.
And I don't think Manfreda is very, very common in the trade, is it?
It is not. It's usually a bioplant. So people that are really plant collectors, appreciate plants outside the box, are probably more in tune to the Manfredas than the general population. And we're trying to change that because... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, if in other words, if we see something that's purplish or patterned and looks a bit like an agave, chances are it's probably a mangave.
Correct.
These days. All right. Continue on.
We had talked a little bit about the plants producing pups at the base of the plant. Many of the agaves will produce aerial plantlets, which are small plants that form on the flower scape after flowering. And for the most part, the agaves that do that pass that trait onto the mangaves. So in the case of purple people eater, Gypsophila was used as a pollen source, and you can see in the middle slide, after flowering, about 6 months to a year later, you have this proliferation of small little plantlets. Like the plants at the bottom of the plant, these are clonal. They're 100% the same as the mother. They could be separated, rooted in. If you leave them on the plant long enough, a lot of times there's root initials where they will take off quite quickly once you put them in soil. And one of the best things about the Mangave flowers to me is the number of pollinators that they attract. This little video clip is one that I made when I was sitting on my deck eating supper. I kept hearing these chirping noises, and I looked up, and there were 2 hummingbirds that were working these mangaves. The individual flowers do have quite a bit of nectar in them, and they kind of seem to be favorites for these hummingbirds. So during the entire time those mangaves were in flower, just about every evening, there was a pair of hummingbirds just working the flowers. To me, I find the mangave flowers quite attractive. They're like miniature lilies in the case of the bad hair day, which has the really nice, soft, rose-colored ones. They really are quite attractive. And in mass, they do put on quite a display.
Hans, Denise is asking how many years to bloom?
That would depend on the cross. Probably the quickest one to flower that we've released is Freckles and Speckles. That can flower in 2 to 3 years, depending on culture. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Blue Dart and Iron Man probably take closer to 6 to 7 years to reach maturity and flower.
Okay, anywhere from as few as 2 to as many as 7 or so. Okay, very good.
Like I mentioned, we live in Zeeland, Michigan, where these are not hardy. Every year we do plant some out for display, and in the fall, in October, right before the first hard frost, we will dig up and containerize the ones we want to salvage and bring over to the next year. It gets to be quite a job because, like I said, some of these have quite a bit of size to them and some weight to them. But a lot of the value is the maturity, and some of it's educational, and we do want to flower those out, breed with them. So we will dig them up and overwinter them in the greenhouse. The greenhouse range we use is at 68 degrees, has supplemental high sodium lighting, and has moderate watering. So as long as they're at that temperature with that light, they're uniformly moist. At home, I have an attached garage to my house. It doesn't freeze. It stays right above about mid-30s to about 40 degrees, depending on what the outside temperature is. And the ones that I have on my patio during the summer, I just set inside the garage. There's some windows in there, but I just, keep them in that cool environment. I do not water them much during the wintertime, maybe once, and then gradually acclimate them to sunlight in the spring. So that's another way to overwinter them if you are trying to overwinter them in a residential area.
Hans, good point for a couple more questions here. Actually, I just had 3 people all at once ask, do they die after flowering?
So it depends on the cross. Bad Hair Day has Geminiflora in it. So once it's done flowering, it behaves like its pollen's parent. It just kind of recalibrates, and that meristem keeps growing. The ones that are more like a Manfreda, which would be Inkblot, Moonglow, Primal Express, that central part of that rosette is finished, where that flower stem is finished, and then it forms probably 3 or 4 new plants to take its place. Something like Purple People Eater produce a lot of aerial pups and basal pups, but that actual rosette is pretty much finished. So in a nutshell, that rosette, with the exception of Bad Hair Day, is finished, and it just depends how the plant reacts. The more Manfreda it has in the background, the more it just kind of recalibrates. If it's very agave-like, then it usually has formed pups earlier in its life cycle or aerial plantlets.
All right. And the next question that quite a few people have asked, and I think you're about to get into, is cold hardiness and the zones. So you're about to go into that, I think. So I know that folks are very interested in just how cold these things will go.
So we work quite a bit with Plant Delight's Nursery, Juniper level botanical gardens, which are a zone 7B. And they have had 3 of them that have come back for them at 7B. Blue Mammoth, Falling Waters, which have Agave ovatifolia in them, and also Bad Hair Day. The difference between some of these climates isn't as much the extreme lows, because some winters here in Michigan, our low temperature isn't that much difference than a 7B. Especially this past winter. The problem is the heavy wet snow on the crown for a really long extended period of time. So I've had some varieties in my home garden that were planted right against the house underneath a soffit that stayed pretty dry, that came back. The exact same variety in the middle of the garden did not. So it's not only just the low temperature, it's a low temperature combined with the wet soil, the wet snow cover. And of course, the ultimate goal would be to develop agaves or Manfredas that look like agaves that are truly winter hardy, and we're getting closer. There are some Manfredas that are hardy up to zone 4. Unfortunately, the ones that are the most cold hardy generally have the least amount of red pigment on them, so they're not as flashy. And generally, the agaves that are the hardiest are also the smallest. But we are working with hardier mangaves, and we are certainly getting a lot closer. Probably the ones that are closest to introduction behave more like a Manfreda, where they are somewhat deciduous and then they flush back in the spring, unlike an agave. And always looking towards the future and exploring new options. We have combined the genetics of a Manfreda, an agave, and the Mexican tuberose, which is a polyanthes, to have a trigeneric hybrid. And the first plant of that cross to be developed here and released is called Jumping Jacks. So there's 3 different genera in the background. This is a quite upright habit. You can see the foliage almost is completely linear. And then when it does flower, it just has this insane inflorescence. And you can see the influence of both the Manfreda and the polyanthes in their nice yellow flowers. Unfortunately, the scent gene did not get transferred through the polyanthes, the Mexican tuberose, so these don't have that sweet gardenia fragrance that Polyanthes tuberosa would have. Just ongoing work, kind of a sneak peek towards the future, just trying to concentrate and intensify that red pigment into the mangaves. We have some now that are almost black. For instance, a Black Magic with the narrow linear leaves has a really nice gloss to it. Night Owl looks a little bit like a Gypsophila type agave, but with really dark pigment, almost black. And then changing the leaf shape and form. This is one that will be coming out next year called Praying Hands. And you can see reminiscent of folded hands or even like an artichoke. This has the plant, the Agave Acahui in the background, so you can see some of the resemblance to that. This form just is really nice, has a nice tear-shaped form. I think it would be great in containers, patios. It's just very distinct.
How big is that, Hans? Give us an idea of that pot size. How big can it get?
That was about a gallon pot. So at maturity, it would probably be about 18 inches tall and maybe 10 inches wide.
Oh, really striking.
So it's been a favorite. It's been hard to keep under wraps because everybody that's seen it really wants it. So we're getting closer. It's in the lab. It should be out next spring.
Yeah, put me down for 2 right now.
All right. And like I said, they are collectible. They do make great container plants. They're among the most on-demanding plants for your patios. And I think folks can really relate to this because of their busy schedules. I think in the spring, a lot of people get really jazzed about their containers. They put together these wonderful combinations, and then right in the middle of the summer, they're on vacation. They come back and maybe they haven't been cared for as well as when they would have been around. Mangaves are really forgiving. If you miss a couple waterings, they're not going to sulk to the degree some of the other perennials or annuals would. So especially among the staff here, a lot of them are transitioning over to more and more mangaves in their patio display just because they are so on-demanding. We've seen a lot of clever folks making new containers to capitalize on the face planters. Bad Hair Day is just a great candidate for that. It's probably our most photogenic plant for these face planters. So there's a lot of people that have been taking selfies and pictures with these face planters, and Bad Hair Day just makes a great inset for those plants. In the home garden, you can also use mangaves as plants that you would bed out in the spring, like your annuals. And at my home, I like to do that right after the last spring frost. So here I am. You've got the creeping phlox still in bloom, the crab apples, and that's when I set them out in the spring. And they really have that real nice architectural feel, just create a lot of drama in the landscape. And basically, the Mangaves do to your sun garden what the hostas did to your shade garden. Just that really nice, great foliage that looks great all season. So throughout the season, you've got the spring shot, which will be just planted. As the season goes on, they just get better and better because they do like that direct light to bring out that leaf intensity. The colors just get better throughout the summer. So in the height of the summer with your lilies, it plays well with the grasses, the rock garden plants, the conifers. You can see just how diverse and flexible they are. Along my driveway, I have a sand bed. The soil is very sandy, of course, being close to Lake Michigan, and it does great with the ice plants and the prickly pear and koala cactus. In another part of the garden where it's more general perennials, it plays well with Alstroemeria from South America. You've got some Ecomis going there with from South Africa. It's just a real Neapolitan combination, but they're very forgiving, very adaptable, and they just add a lot of drama. And towards the end of the season, you've got your sedum and your Orstachys really coming into their own, and that's a perfect combination pairing for your Mangaves. And of course, with the conifers, just a match made in heaven. And here we are in October. The pumpkins that are out, the ornamental grasses have really peaked. They're at their full peak in fall color, and the Mangaves, once again, are really complementing that whole ensemble. And of course, the ultimate goal would be to have some that would tolerate the Michigan winters, because once all the other perennials go down, the ones that have some hardiness in, which would be the vetifolia types, some of the other hardier species, they do hang on through quite a bit of the winter before they do actually rot off, and that texture and size really complements the other plants in the garden with your conifers and your grasses. Folks are always curious and want to know where they can see Mangaves in public gardens. If anybody is like me, seeing is believing, and I always want to visit public gardens, seeing what's out there, what other people combine with plants. So the next few set of images are places that have pretty good Mangave collections that folks can go and visit, see for themselves. In North Carolina, there's the J.C. Ralston Arboretum in Raleigh, and they have Mangaves featured on top of their roof garden. At the Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Chapel Hill, they had a really nice collection on their ledge in the patio area. Probably the most intense outdoor collection of Mangave is at the United States National Arboretum, and that is mostly due to the passion and design work of Bradley Evans. And he has really featured that front entrance to the visitor center as a showpiece for Mangaves. There's beautiful ones in containers, mature ones around the reflecting pool, and then in the base gardens, with his clever artistic eye, he has done these harmonious plantings that pick up the colors of the Mangaves as well as color echoes. So you can see how well they play with that texture with the other dark grasses that pick up those bronze and burgundy tones. Also in Washington, D.C., Janet Draper at the Mary Ripley Gardens has used them. This is a public garden that's open 24 hours a day, so she's got to be a little bit more clever with some of her design skills. These potted Mangaves are actually attached to the base to make sure that they don't migrate throughout and out of the garden. But a really nice assortment, a great place to visit if you are in the Washington, D.C. area. And then, of course, in Iowa, if you ever get the chance to visit the Greater Des Moines Botanical Gardens, Kelly Norris has been a champion of Mangaves. I think he's a self-proclaimed evangelist, just very enthusiastic about their uses and how they relate and can be incorporated. He's got them featured both on the balcony in the conservatory a really nice combination, which you can see here in the video, as well as planted in the ground at the bottom of the conservatory, both with the tropical plants, and then also showcased in the arid section. Juniper level botanical gardens, Raleigh, North Carolina. We have been working with Tony for probably 15 years on the Mangave project. He has been very supportive, both with sharing genetics, helping us trial them, give us direction, and it's a really great place to see them, both in containers as well as in the ground with the ones that are hardy. And like I said, the falling waters and the blue mammoths have been hardy for them in North Carolina. Back to the Midwest, the Chicago Botanical Gardens had a very nice display late last summer in their walled garden. And then also this year, 2020, they will be featured on the top of the rooftop garden in a container planting. So that's another opportunity for individuals in the upper Midwest to interact and look at Mangaves. They have been used at Longwood Gardens, just an incredible, talented team of horticulturalists work there. You can see them combined with different textures, complementing foliage in the conservatories. And then, of course, at seasonal display, somebody was very clever, incorporated Mangave into these Tillandsia wreaths. So you've got these beautiful living wreaths, look great during the day, and then they were lit up at nighttime. And last but not least, at Walters Gardens, we do have them in containers here as well as featured in the landscape. Every year during the last weekend, July, first week in August, we are open for the Michigan nurseryman tours. So that's a great opportunity to see the facilities and to see the public gardens where we are using them. They're all labeled so you can really see how distinct they are, how they relate to each other. Good UV coloration, they are planted outside. And then touching base a little bit on marketing. So how did this obscure botanical plant that originated from a nursery in Hempstead, Texas, become an internet fun plant, really embraced with the millennials using selfies? So I'm going to talk a little bit on marketing. We have a marketing department here at Walters Gardens. They put together some really nice brochures and Mangaves, a lot of colored pictures. So the candidates and members of the Mad About Mangave series are pictured in this brochure with a really nice description and then a silhouette that explains their size, growth rate, habit. And it's a really nice educational tool to help you learn about Mangaves. There's an online presence called Mad About Mangave, another online resource that's maintained by Walters Gardens for more online information. We provide tags to go with the Mangaves, weather-resistant tags, nice color picture on the front of a mature plant, cultural information on the back, and these tags affix to a stake that the retailer would put above the plant so that they're not actually in the foliage, they're held up well above the plant. Social media, there is a Facebook page dedicated to Mangaves, and we try to have current content, post at least something once a week, a new way to use an existing variety, a nice way to showcase a new release, or how customers and friends have used them in their gardens and container planting. And recently we have partnered with Plantip, primarily through Peter Van Ryzen, and he is an energetic, enthusiastic marketing person, and he is crazy about Mangaves. And here you can see promoting the Mangaves in Europe. This February, they were released at the IPM show in Essen in Germany, and you can see some of the publications that came out. And he also works with Michael Perry, who probably is one of the biggest Mangave fans. There's one of Michael Perry's photo shoots where he is mad about Mangave. And I don't think there's anybody that's Mangaves had made more of a lasting impression on Then Michael Perry, here he has quite a section of his back dedicated to his living canvas, where he has 7 of the Mangaves that will leave a permanent mark, proudly displayed on his back. Peter Van Ryzen was coming up with solutions for people that love Mangaves but don't want a permanent impact on their body, so they came up with these really cool nylon sleeves, which you can have, wear around in public, which are a temporary tattoo if you don't want the commitment of permanently having a tattoo of Mangave on your body. This second to the last slide just shows botanical gardens, arboretums that have nice collections of Mangaves, where to see them if you're in the area. And I hope you like Mangaves as much as we do, and thank you for spending time with us as we talk about Mangaves and how they can be used in your garden and nursery.
Excellent, Hans. They're applauding right now, I guarantee. And a few of them have run out to get tattoos. I'm pretty much certain about that. Although, you did say they do one thing wrong in Europe with Mangave, right?
Most of the friends that have pronounced it have called them Mangave.
There you go. So if you're in Europe and somebody mentions Mangave, don't correct them. Kalanchoe, Kalanchoe, tomato. You had a few others too, Hans, but as long as they're buying them, that's the main thing. Well, excellent information. We've got quite a few questions, and let's see if we can run down these. Stick on, everybody, and I'll try to get to yours. Keith, who also happens to be a Hansen, must be a cousin of yours. He wonders if you have a list of cultivars at Walters sorted by cold hardiness. He said he's in 8A, and his mission to Mars did not do too well during a 20-degree cold spell. So he's looking for cultivars sorted by cold hardiness. Can you help him out with that?
So the hardiest would be the that we carry would be Falling Waters, Whale Tail, and also Bad Hair Day.
All right, and you're talking zone 6 at that point, right?
Hardy. Those were for hardy for zone 7B, not zone 6. So
okay, now you're in zone 6. So are you
6,
overwintering? You're not overwintering anything outside then. You're having to lift them and move them in.
They are lifted in the fall and taken into a greenhouse. Yep. We do hardiness trials, but like I said, out of those varieties in zone 6, they have not proven to be hardy.
All right, we'll have some more questions about pots in a minute. Brad wants to know finish time from a 72 cell in a 1-gallon pot. Average finish time.
So depending on the time of year, if you get them in the spring, they should put on quite a bit of growth and be ready, most varieties, midsummer.
Oh, that fast? For 4 or 5 months?
Yep. I mean, you can grow them longer and, have a bigger pot.
But they'd be sellable in a gallon.
It depends on the variety. Tooth Fairy has a more modest growth. Some of the fastest would be like the Freckles and Speckles, Mission to Mars. So that picture I showed earlier in the talk would have been that first season. So probably about August was what they had looked like. And the leaves were, certainly outside the pot, rooted to the bottom.
All right. A couple more growing questions. Anne wants to know ideal soil mix in containers. I would assume something fairly sandy and well-drained, since these things are succulents.
Correct. We use Metromix 700. There's a good bark component in there. Good drainage holes in the bottom. Of course, we're growing them in greenhouses. If you grow them outside, you probably want to increase the amount of bark so that they're well-drained. Right.
And Anne mentioned Spotty Dotty cultivar, I assume. Lower leaves tend to get mushy and upper leaves are not very strong. We don't believe we're watering too much. Actually, that's from Kathy. What can you advise Kathy with mushy lower leaves and weak upper leaves?
What's the growing environment? Is that inside in a greenhouse or?
Does not say whether that's in a greenhouse, shade house, or outdoors in full sun. If you want to weigh in, Kathy, with a little more detail, maybe we can get back to that. Let's see, pest problems. Who asked that? Kara wants to know any pest or disease or insect or disease issues.
We've seen aphids on the flowers. We have seen thrip in greenhouse conditions. And that's part of the reason that we have used the beneficial mites is for thrip. They are closely related to a hosta, so some of the same insects that would affect a hosta would affect an agave or mangave.
How about slugs and snails? Megan's asking. She's in the Pacific Northwest.
We don't have much slug and snail problem here. Our slugs and snails are not anything at all like the Pacific Northwest. So they're in the lily family. I would say it's possible, especially the ones that are more Manfreda-like, that the snails and slugs might be a problem.
All right, let's see.
It probably has the banana slugs, which probably have a pretty good appetite.
Yeah, and would they want to eat something that hard and stiff versus a nice tender?
So the ones that are more Manfreda-like, so the moonglow, the ink blot probably would be more tender than things like the whale's tail, falling waters that are more fibrous.
Okay. Karen wants to know, so if you're bumping up, say you're going from gallons to the next size up, is it better to do it kind of gradually, or can you go like right from a gallon to do a 3-gallon?
I've gone gallon to 3-gallon, provided it's in the spring and your soil is very porous.
All right. She also wants to know, and this is an interesting question, if you're transplanting and you're cleaning some sort of, old dead leaves off the bottom of a plant, do you repot deeper, bury that stem, or do you need to leave it up at soil level?
We do not go deeper than it was before. So,
but
if you go from pot to pot,
it's low pot foliage.
If you take some of that foliage off, you could probably sink it down a little bit. I wouldn't want to bury it too much deeper than it had been planted initially.
All right. And if you're losing too many leaves, then maybe you have some kind of a cultural issue you need to.
Maybe the soil's not draining quite well enough.
Right.
I know one of the tricks some growers will do is to underpot them early on, and instead of filling a pot to the grade that you would typically, fill your pot, let's say an inch or half an inch down, they would sink it maybe 2 inches down, and that way when that first flush of leaves go, they kind of arch up, and then you can put them closer together in production and ship them easier.
Okay.
The ones that have a very horizontal growth rate.
Okay. Let's see. We got a little more information about the spotty dotty, Zone 10, Florida, outside full sun. Which they should like. They're from Mexico, right?
Yes, we have sent several folks in Florida that have been growing the mangave, and what surprised us was how the growth rate is so different in Florida than it is from California. Of course, they like the heat, they like the high light, but they really respond well to the moisture. So the growth rate was a lot faster in Florida than we expected.
In that humidity, does that help you with the question of why does the spotty dotties have rotting lower foliage and weak upper foliage?
I don't know if that would be variety specific. It's a hybrid of Bovar cornuta, which I don't know how well does in that much humidity, but for the most part, they have thrived in Florida.
All right. Well,
so
you need to shoot that question.
It puzzles me a little bit.
Yeah, shoot some more details to Hans and see if we can't help you out there. Let me get to a couple of others. let's look ahead to, well, let's see. Somebody is asking, what's the largest size that Walters has for sale? You're not selling finished, though, are you? Or are you just doing...
we are not. Currently, they are in trays of 72. They have the 2 assorted trays, 6 varieties in a tray, 12 each. We are looking into 20 count trays for the folks that want a larger input size and maybe not so many. But that is not an option for this following year for the catalog. But that is something we are looking into.
Okay. Wait, we have one more flowering question. Actually, 2 flowering questions. Once it flowers, how long does the flower last? And how long might it take to bloom again? Another 2 to 7 years?
Okay, the flower opens the first day, the pollen becomes dehisced. The second day, the stigma is receptive. By the third day, it's starting to deteriorate. So basically 2 full days. Depending on the length of the inflorescence and the number of flowers, they can be in flower for several weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And then if it's, like I mentioned, something like the Pineapple Express, Moonglow, Ink Blot, a lot of times when they form those new plantlets at the bottom, those will flower at least a year sooner than the original one. If you start with a little pup off the bottom, that is going to put you back into your 2 to 7 year range.
Ah, okay. And if you see the spikes starting to form, can you clip it off and keep your plant growing, or is it already, once that spike begins to form, is it already headed on the way out?
Generally, what we found from our research is once that inflorescence spike shoots out of that clump, that plant is reproductive. So if you cut that big spike off, what will happen is you probably will get 3 to 5 smaller spikes that take its place that are also reproductive. So instead of having a 6 to 8 foot spike with a single spike, you might have 3 to 5 much shorter ones, in the 3 foot range. It needs to go through that cycle, flower and get to the point where it's finished flowering before you cut it down and switching back to vegetative.
All right, 2 more here. Any potential for indoor plant use? Say if you're holding it over the winter, can you put it in a pot indoors, or say it's on the patio in the summer, indoors in the wintertime?
Yeah, so the interesting fact is almost all of the office staff at Walters Gardens do have mangaves as plants in their office. So we've seen them do well, south window, east window, west window. They last a very long time with low light. There are a few folks that don't have windows in their office here, and it is surprising how long they do look quite attractive without any direct light. Of course, you'll want to decrease the amount of water, but they are very forgiving, and generally the ones that are the slower growing ones probably are the easiest ones to hold. Once you do decide, it's warm in the spring, you take them outside, it's important to acclimate that plant gradually. Don't go from, the analogy of northern Minnesota to Florida in one day, because you are going to experience burn. So if you could, acclimate them to the higher lights gradually, it's a lot better for the plant. But yeah, a lot of people, they collect them, they get attached to them. If they don't have a greenhouse, either an attached garage that doesn't freeze, lights in the basement, windows, they make nice house plants.
Well, that's beautiful. There's a whole other webinar right there. And we're going to need to do a whole other webinar on the topic because we've run way out of time here. Thanks, everybody, for all those great questions. Sorry if I didn't get to yours, but if you email Walters Gardens at this address that's on your screen, yes, it's sort of the sales mailbox, but that way they can direct the question either to Hans or another cultural expert if it's a cultural question. And if it's a variety or availability question, then the sales folks can take care of it. That way Hans can get back out into the field and start hunting for more things. I have one last question. Since it has agave blood in it, can you make tequila, a Mangave tequila? Is there any possibility for something along those lines?
I think you need to make tequila out of a specific agave called Tequiliana, but liquor could be made from, I think, probably any of the Mangave, and that would be Mescal. Um,
Uh,
I I haven't tried it, but that probably would be a good project for our friends to work on.
there you go. It's up there. For anybody who wants to give it a try, just, well, I'd say send me the first bottle, but no, you drink it first, and if it's okay, then. All right. Well, on that, if you want to go back and relive this webinar, pick up any details that you may have missed along the way, or share it with anyone else, you can do so. Well, as soon as I'm done with this webinar, I'll try to get it archived within a half hour or an hour or something like that. At growertalks.com/webinars. And so for that, Hans, thank you so much for a fabulous webinar, fascinating, and I look forward to seeing what other amazing hybrids you can come up with in Mangaves. And now you got these tri-hybrids. Tribrids? Is that what you called it? Something like that?
Trigeneric hybrids.
Trigeneric hybrids. As you're out there botanizing, another term I learned today. But anyway, for Hansen, all the fine folks at Walter's Gardens, and for my stellar ball publishing staff who work hard so I don't have to, this is Chris Beatty saying, so long, everybody.